Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is the 8th of our 8 workshops in our Sustainable Landscape series, and my name is Suzane Barlcay. I'm the Executive Director here at Cornell Cooperative Extension. And tonight I'll be making the case for outdoor water conservation here in Rockland. But before we get to our presentation, just a few of the normal housekeeping issues. Feel free to ask questions by typing them in chat or the Q&A, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And at the very end, a brief survey will pop up on your screen, and you can tell me whether I succeeded or not in convincing you about the need to conserve water here. We will try to end by 8 o'clock, so if for some reason your question wasn't addressed, or if you have any feedback you want to share with us directly, please email us at rockland@cornell.edu. And finally, tonight, I want to thank our funders, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Hudson River Estuary Program, the New York State Water Resources Institute for making this series possible, and for Deirdre Heyman, our communications manager, for making it all work. So tonight we are talking one last time, at least in this series, about outdoor water conservation. And my background is in planning. I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not a water engineer, but I try to stay informed about this issue. I became interested in it some years ago when the proposed desalination project was being discussed. And since then, I've become a member of the Conservation Committee of the Water Task Force, which I'll explain shortly. So let's get started, and I will share my screen. So the purpose of tonight's presentation is to convince you of the need to conserve water here in Rockland and to present some very easy steps for you to do so. And this is really a review of the previous 7 speakers in our series. So that will make up our conservation tips, if you will. So what I'd like to do tonight is to provide an overview of our water supply, to explain where it comes from, who provides it, and how we use it, and then go into a bit about our county's conservation plan, and then finally into actual steps we can all take to conserve. So that's our outline for tonight. So our water comes from essentially the rainfall that is hopefully captured within our borders in either a couple of aquifers or a reservoir. So you probably recall that an aquifer is simply permeable rock, and we have the Newark Basin bedrock aquifer that really starts in eastern Pennsylvania, goes through New Jersey, and ends in Rockland, and it is made up of sedimentary rock. Then we have the Ramapo and Mahwah alluvial aquifers. So that type of aquifer is simply made up of gravel and sand that is beneath the riverbed. And then finally, we have some surface reservoirs. We have Lake DeForest, that's the largest one. And then there is another one called Letchworth, which is, I believe, in Harriman. So here's a map of the county, obviously. And if you can see my pointer, here is Lake DeForest, which then goes into the Hackensack River, which then becomes Lake Tappan and goes into New Jersey. And up here, I believe, is the Letchworth Reservoir. So we are, what I'd like to do first, though, is remind you of the hydrologic cycle. You may not have seen this for a while, and I think it's good to remember just how it all works. So rain falls, snow falls, it hits the ground, and if it is ground, if it is vegetation of some kind or grass, then it is likely absorbed beneath the surface and either goes into groundwater or actually into bedrock, okay, and into our aquifers. But if it isn't, if it doesn't hit a permeable surface, if instead it hits a parking lot or a sidewalk or a roadway, then it's going to run off that hard surface and make its way to the nearest water body, be it a stream or river. And then, as you can see from this diagram, that river eventually makes its way into the ocean. So long story short, if our rainfall hits these hard surfaces and goes into the nearest stream, it's headed to the Hudson River and then eventually the ocean, and it's lost to the county. Oh, and to complete the cycle, then of course, evaporation from rivers, streams, reservoirs makes its way back into the atmosphere. Also transpiration from plants and from soil as well. So that's the hydrologic cycle, in case you forgot. So we're very fortunate here in New York. We are a water-rich state. So in general, the state receives an average of almost 42 inches of rain a year. Here in Rockland, we get even more than that, 50 inches typically, which is quite a bit when you compare it to someplace like Phoenix, which gets less than 10 inches. But the lesson here is no matter whose straw it is that we're drinking from, it's all coming from the same glass. And in this case, it's an aquifer. So who provides this drinking water? Well, we have several providers here in the county. So unlike other places, we have a private company that provides our water, that's Suez, formerly known as United Water, formerly known as, I believe, the Hackensack Water Company, and perhaps before that it was Spring Valley. So we have a long history of privately held water supply. The two villages of Nyack and Suffering provide water to about 8% of the residents in Rockland, and then another 4% have private wells. So there's something like 6,000 wells in the county. And then finally, there's a handful of others that provide their own water supply, like Pfizer. And I meant to say at this point, no matter who's providing your water, we're all taking it from the same source, and that is our aquifers. So how do we use this water in Rockland? Well, you can see from this chart, which is actually from 2005, about 63% is residential use. So this is people, using water in the course of a day for bathing, cooking, cleaning, that kind of thing. And then we have another 10% that is used by our county's commercial businesses, industry, government, institutions like hospitals, schools. Then we have actually 5.6% is used for industrial cooling purposes, and a very small percentage, less than 4%, is for golf courses and agricultural use. But what you'll notice on this chart, the green area actually represents 18% of the water use, which is during the summer, okay? So this chart is from 2005, and 18% is quite a large percentage. And so here we see it graphically in a slightly different way. This is a chart that shows Suez's water production. This is from their wells that peaks during the summer. So between the months of June, July, August, and September. So this is the problem, right? That we use the most water at the worst possible time. So we use it during the hottest months of the year, when there's the least amount of rain, when there's the most likelihood of a drought, when there's the most evaporation and the highest temperatures. So I want to move into a quick discussion about factors that affect our water supply. And basically there's three. There's population, of course. More people mean more water use for, activities of daily living, bathing, cooking, cleaning, that kind of thing. More people also means likely more development, more housing for new residents, more building for businesses. So that's that development. When we talk about development here, the real concern is impervious surfaces. And then finally, the third factor is climate change. So let's talk first about population. So this is a chart prepared by the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council in 2015. And you'll see that the projection then for the year 2020 was 327,825 people. They were off a bit because our 2020 census indicates that actually our population in 2020 was 338,329. And in fact, that exceeds the population projected for 2025. So we're a little bit off here for this projection. So I talked before about building. So new building that occurs for new residents leads to more coverage of the surface, okay? And it leads to harder surfaces replacing permeable surfaces. So I think this is a pretty dramatic illustration of this. So again, a county map. This was prepared in 2007 by the county GIS department. And so you'll see the top northwestern edge of the county right here is parkland. It's Harriman. And then you'll see other green swaths. Here's High Tor State Park, and here's the Palisades Ridge. The rest of the map, as you can see, is pretty much covered by the color brown, which indicates impervious surfaces. And again, this was created in 2007. So that's 14, almost 15 years ago. So I would imagine that if we were to update this map, it would look even more thoroughly covered in brown. So again, the issue with impervious surface is that stormwater is not able to be absorbed by the ground when it hits a parking lot. Instead, it becomes runoff. It sheets over that surface and makes its way to the nearest stream, brook, or river, and it adds to that flow. And it's essentially lost to us as water supply. So another impact of this impervious surface is, this is an illustration done by a hydrologist whom I'll discuss later, Paul Heisig. And this graph shows that there is a relationship between impervious coverage of a watershed and the rate of flow of stormwater runoff. And essentially, the story here, or the bottom line, is that the greater the impervious surface within a watershed, the faster the flow into rivers of stormwater runoff. And what that means is when you have a big rain event with a lot of rain coming in a short period, that means that the water flowing into these rivers flows at an even higher rate than it otherwise would. And that can lead to scouring. It can lead to erosion of riverbeds or stream banks and turbidity of water, and also flooding. So it's a serious issue. So just one more little story about stormwater, because we don't often see it until it's in the middle of a storm. And people have can have difficulty understanding the importance of it. So this is just a little story that actually surprised me. So you all recall Hurricane Ida dumped, what, 2 to 3 inches per hour during this storm in September. So this is actually a photo of my backyard. I have a small stream that bisects the yard, and we were prepared for Ida. We had erected a barrier across the yard to prevent the stream from flooding and coming into my first floor. Well, my husband and I went out to check it at night. The rain had changed from a heavy downpour to a flash flood. So that barrier lasted maybe 3 minutes, then it was flattened. And a lot of the stuff on my back porch was swept away. I didn't have much, but I actually, my husband had a pair of his Crocs on the porch and they were swept away. So about a month later, I happened to be on the Piermont Pier one day, and there had just been a pretty good rainstorm the night before, and it had washed up all sorts of debris onto the roadway, including a lot of plastic stuff, which is pretty typical in the Hudson. And lo and behold, here was the Croc, the missing Croc. So I think it's a pretty amazing story. So this Croc left my property in Orangeburg, went into a small tributary to the Sparkill Creek, went down the Sparkill Creek, and ended up in the Hudson River. So the lesson here is that stormwater runoff, instead of replenishing our aquifers, will take any matter of litter, trash, fertilizers, oil drippings from cars, animal waste, and sweep it into the nearest water body. So back to our third factor that impacts water supply, that's climate change. So we know climate change means warmer temperatures, therefore greater surface evaporation from our reservoirs. It means more snow and more rainfall in the winter and less in the summer, and then bigger storms, heavier downpours. And you all, I'm sure you recall Tropical Storm Irene. This is a photo of flooding that occurred here in the county in August of 2011. So that's sort of a basic overview of our water supply and what factors impact it. So now I want to talk a little bit about why we're so focused on water conservation today. So this goes back some years, actually really not 1981, a little bit later, but this was a drought in Rockland at this is Lake DeForest during a drought. It is almost completely dry. Then I believe there was another drought in the early 90s. There was another one in about 2004, 2005. I live near Lake Tapan. Lake Tapan had dried up to the extent that it was only there was only water in the Hackensack riverbed. So Lake Tapan is simply the Hackensack River that's been allowed to expand. And when I saw that drought, there were actually fish struggling in the mud in what little water was left in the river. So it was a serious event. And this made a big impact on people. They got very nervous. So what happened was in 2004, the county legislature decided to delve into this issue and find out just how serious our water supply issue was. So they hired the USGS to do an analysis of the aquifers. So the Newark Basin bedrock aquifer, as well as the Mahwah and Ramapo alluvial aquifers. A couple years later, in 2006, the New York State Public Service Commission ordered United Water, because it was United Water still, to create a new water supply by 2015. So I'm sure many of you remember that history. United Water at the time proposed a desalination plant. They built a pilot project in the Hudson. Over time, community opposition arose, significant community opposition, to the point where in 2014, the New York State Public Service Commission retracted that statement and told United Water they had to halt the project. And in doing so, the chairwoman of the Public Service Commission, Audrey Ziebelman, instructed United Water to instead develop a water conservation plan that will help meet the needs of Rockland for the next decade. This is the analysis of the aquifers that was done by Paul Heisig. He released that in 2010. And his major finding was not that our aquifers were not recharging, but the real concern was our summertime water use. That's it in a nutshell. So after this work was completed, after United Water was told they should abandon the desalination project, that led to the creation of the county's water task force. So that was created in 2014 by Chairwoman Harriet Cornell. And the mission is simply to develop a water plan that ensures a safe long-term water supply for the county that incorporates sustainability, demand-side principles, and conservation. So I want to talk about that conservation plan now briefly. So the Water Task Force hired an engineering firm, Jacobs, to prepare this plan. The consultant held a couple of community meetings. They sought a lot of public input and incorporated that into the plan. And here's the plan. So the plan was released in March of 2020, literally weeks before everything shut down because of COVID. So the timing was a little difficult. So actually, Rockland County has two water conservation plans. So Suez has prepared its own conservation plan, and then the task force has had Jacobs prepare one for it. So these plans are complementary, and to some extent they overlap. But they also, each entity is able to do, take specific steps that the other one cannot. So for example, Suez can offer rebates on water saving equipment. They cannot legislate. The county cannot set water rates, but they can regulate. So in a way, these two plans are complementary. And both of them emphasize education on water conservation. So I want to go into a little bit about this plan. So Jacobs looked at 4 water conservation scenarios for 2050, and they used that information then to come up with recommended measures for conservation. So they actually developed 20 measures, and I'm not going to go through each one, but for each measure, they considered near-term and long-term savings and impacts. They considered both monetary and non-monetary actions. They looked at co-benefits. They looked at water savings that they could actually quantify, although that wasn't always possible. And they considered implementation. To what extent was the conservation measure implementable by government or some other entity? And finally, they looked at both indoor and outdoor water use. So they came up with, I said, 20 measures, and they fall into 3 categories. So first of all, it's education and information. The second category is incentives, and the third is regulation. So you can see these, there's a range of sort of the low-hanging fruit, which is the education, all the way to the most challenging, which is, of course, trying to pass legislation. So for each of the 20 measures, they go into some detail. They talk about the intent, about how they work potentially with other measures, who takes the lead on implementation, who else do they partner with, what is some guidance for actually getting the measure done, as well as potential costs and water savings. So there's quite a bit of information provided for each measure. So the first 6 I mentioned address public education, and there are 6 measures, and we are right there, number 3, a sustainable landscaping education program. So for each of these measures, the plan spells out who takes the lead, which level of government. For these, it's all local government. Okay, so it's county government, or it could be town or village. They look at whether or what time frame these should be implemented in. And in each case for these particular measures, it's near term, midterm, and long term. So it's from here on out. And then in terms of potential water savings, that's discussed later, a bit later. They also went into some detail for each of these measures in terms of who these measures are directed to, whether it's residential or business, and again, whether it's addressing indoor or outdoor water use. Then they tried to estimate cost savings, which is a really difficult thing to try to quantify potential cost savings on potential conservation. But they did use a study that was done previously in California, and they're suggesting that if all 6 measures for education were actually put into place, there'd be a 4.6 reduction in water use. So you might think, well, that's not a lot of money, but actually compared to developing and constructing a new water supply, it's quite a bit of savings, actually. So I mentioned that there are 3 categories. The first is education. The second are incentives. So they have 8 measures that address various incentives. So for example, one might be institutional or government retrofit. So a government could look at all of the plumbing fixtures in their restrooms, kitchens, and decide to swap out for more energy efficient fixtures. And we would look for a rebate of some kind from the water supplier, in this case, Suez. Or another incentive might be a little bit different in that it doesn't directly involve money, and that's changing the land use approval process and allowing some leeway in granting variances if there were significant water conservation proposed in the site plan. So that's another way of producing an incentive that doesn't directly involve an outlay of money. So again, for these 8 incentives, the plan explains who takes the lead, what the time frame is, and what the potential water savings are. And then, excuse me, finally, we have the last 5. And these are the regulations. And these are the most challenging, as you can imagine, because it requires passing an ordinance or instituting a new regulation. So to look at one in particular, number 19 is lawn and irrigation schedule. And the idea here is to introduce a regulation that would determine when a homeowner can water their yard. And it might be, you know, even days, depending on what side of the street you live on, even or odd days. It might concern regulating the time of day that you water. There might be conditions for if you are, caught watering the sidewalk. Your irrigation system is, watering the sidewalk, or it's left on during the rain. So this is one way to regulate lawn watering. I will say it is controversial, but it has been discussed, and it may yet be further explored in the future. I did note that just this week, the state of California, which is in a severe drought, is considering legislation that would make it a $500 a day fine for a homeowner who is caught, hosing down the driveway or otherwise wasting outdoor water. So they're getting serious there. So that's the county's conservation plan. It is quite thorough. It does address, both education incentives and legislation. And so it is yet to be implemented, but we did try to start that with our education series by reaching out to people to explain your role in reducing outdoor water use. So your role is very simple. It's to reduce water when you're outside watering your garden, if you're watering your grass. We ask that you educate your family, friends, and neighbors about the need to conserve because it's not obvious to a lot of people, and also to learn more. So to learn more, we have, and I'm sorry, I also wanted to just review some of the very specific ideas that our previous speakers in this series had discussed. So, we had 7 other speakers. One was Dr. Frank Rossi from Cornell. He happens to be a turf management specialist. And his message throughout his talk was, you really don't need to water your lawn. You get enough water in Rockland, in the form of rain. You don't need to water. Donna D'Souza, who presented on soils, gave the message that you should be watering your roots, not leaves. So that is a different kind of watering, rather than sprinkling the whole plant, but rather water at the ground level. I think it was Don Gable who said you should be watering early in the day, not midday, when it is more likely to evaporate than actually get into the ground. Jen Zanino-Smith talked about stormwater management, washing your car on the lawn. And then we had Brian Eschenauer urging people to minimize the use of pesticides and fertilizer, if you must use them at all. One way to keep the weeds down and to keep your soil more moist is to keep it mulched throughout the year. And finally, and I think both Don Gable and Brian Eschenauer talked about the idea of reducing turf with ground cover, because turf does often, or people tend to overwater turf. So those are just some of the ideas that are very easy to implement. I will say the replacing the turf with ground cover is maybe not so easy. That's a project, but the others are pretty straightforward and easily enough to implement. And then there are numerous resources if you're interested in going into this a little bit deeper. You can look at the county conservation plan. Of course, it's online. You can go to the EPA. They have a whole raft of resources in their WaterWise program. You can go to the Cornell's New York State Water Resources Institute, the state's Department of Environmental Conservation, or our own website. We have a lot of resources on water conservation. So I would like to leave you with one message, and that is, we are faced with a number of environmental issues here in Rockland. We have a burgeoning deer population. We don't know the solution for that yet. We have numerous invasive plant species, which are everywhere. And now we have the spotted lanternfly, which it's made its way into the county. And these are all pretty challenging problems. But actually, water conservation is not a challenging issue. It's easy to address. It's not a sacrifice to do so. It doesn't take much time, and it saves you money. So this is something I think we can easily accomplish. So that's my case for outdoor water conservation in Rockland. And so now I'd like to stop sharing my screen and find out if anybody has any questions.
Suzanne, I don't see any questions right now in the Q&A or the chat, but we do have someone comment, a special consideration should be given for water used for food production in gardens and for pollinator gardens. And that's
an excellent comment, Althea. Thank you for that. No, you're right. I think you can make a case that you'd have a different level of conservation, certainly for gardening for food and for pollinators. So I think that's a great idea.
Okay, and I think that's all I have.
So if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight and throughout the year for our series. And again, if you'd like to explore this issue more, please check out the resources, especially, our own website, our own web pages. So
and if anyone has any other questions pertaining to the series or the certification, feel free to email me as well. I know Adam Carson is away right now, so it might be a little bit before you get that, but feel free to reach out to me. We'll have my email at the end of this, and don't forget the survey that pops up at the end. If you could just take the time to take that, we'd really appreciate it. Tell Suzanne how amazing she did. Okay, thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you all, and happy holidays.
Have a good night.